Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 341 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on what is dysgraphia, and it is Sunday the 24th of August 2025 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is absolutely fascinating, it's really fun, and it's really interesting to me for a personal reason. So by the end of today's podcast episode, we're going to learn about what is dysgraphia, what causes the condition, and how is dysgraphia treated. So dysgraphia is a learning difficulty that mainly impacts people's handwriting, ability to write in between the lines, and a whole bunch of other facets, which is important, especially in school children. And the reason why I wanted to take today's episode to explore the condition is because when I went for my learning difficulties assessment in December 2024, this was something that the psychologist doing the assessment actually looked at me for, because my handwriting was really bad and she was concerned about my fine motor skills, which is very characteristic of dysgraphia. At the end, I didn't manage to get a dysgraphia diagnosis because it didn't match me and my symptoms, but it was still really interesting and a good learning experience. So that's why I really wanted to focus on it in today's podcast episode. And even if you don't think that you're going to work with people with learning difficulties, in today's podcast episode, I really did try and focus about trying to make it as relevant to aspiring and clinical psychologists as possible. So this is a great episode, you're going to really enjoy it and you're going to learn a lot. So you've got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. But before we move on to the psychology news section, I just want to mention and apologise again this week. I'm not in my audio booth. The stuff is now at my parents' house, but me and my dad, we haven't had the time to actually set it up yet, because we're both working, we're both really busy with other stuff. But next week we are going to build the audio booth again. So the sound quality should be back to normal by next week. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and the first one is: newborn babies may have an innate sense of prosocial behaviour. We are a remarkably cooperative species, at least on the whole, capable of working together to everyone's benefit. Research into the cognitive and emotional underpinnings of this has pointed to everything from our ability to feel empathy to the fundamental preference for prosocial rather than antisocial people. The fact that these abilities and attitudes are seen across cultures and may have been observed in even younger babies has led to the idea that human morality itself may stem, at least from evolved adaptations for sustaining cooperation within larger groups. Note the authors of a recent paper in Natural Communications. However, even the youngest babies in these early studies had at least 3 months egg experience in the world, writes Alexandra Gertie at the University of Catalan and colleagues. In their latest investigation, they gathered data from newborns and found surprising indications that even at days old, babies may have some of this innate understanding of what it means to behave prosocially. Okay, now this is surprising, and I really like this article for a few reasons, because it reminds me of something I was doing like yesterday. So shocking, I'm on like dating apps at the moment, that I matched with with a few people yesterday, and one of the opening questions was, or the opening moves as this app calls it. Now, why dating apps always have to have such weird names for their stuff, I will never understand. But what I do find interesting is that this person was talking about green flags, so I did mine. And when I really think about it, at least in the context of prosocial behaviour, all of my green flags and red flags are to do with people showing prosocial behaviour and healthy relationship skills, which this all ties into. So, linking it back to the article, it does make you question about when do we start developing these things? Because I completely agree. The main criticism and the main problem with these research studies that look at 3-month-old babies, these babies have still been in the world for 3, 6, 2 months, so they've been able to observe, focus on the world, learn about what is egg acceptable and what isn't egg acceptable, and what's occurring. So the fact that we've been able to research babies that are only like a few days old is quite, to be honest, fascinating. Because one, I would love to see the ethics for this. Like, this ethics form must have been so long that I commend the researchers for just wanting to fill in that ethics form. Yeah, because any of my more in those studies have had to have such long ethics forms, then this is what I just avoid working with children, full stop, because the ethics are a nightmare. Anyway, so going away from my ethics induced anxiety at times, so the fact that we can now understand and we know that babies that are only a few days old might have prosocial inclinations is very surprising, but it would also be interesting to see, like, now that we've got this information, where do we take it? How do we apply this research and this understanding? And is it possible to create an intervention where we continue and we're able to tap into these prosocial inclinations just to make society more prosocial as a whole? Just some food for thought. So the next one is, matching workouts to personality can make them more fun. Despite our best intentions, few of us actually hit recommended activity levels, and almost 1/3 of us worldwide don't get enough exercise, according to some recent figures. Many of us chalk our exercise habits up to who we are, perhaps holding the belief that some of us are naturally sporty personalities and some don't. According to some research, this sort of things are true. For example, research suggests that outgoing, conscientious, and agreeable people are more likely to move regularly and enjoy it, whereas those high in neuroticism are less likely to get a kick out of moving about, and they can feel particularly anxious about it and skip the gym altogether. Understanding these differences could be key to helping more people get active, say the authors of a new study published in Frontiers in Psychology. There, Fleming and Roker and colleagues at University College London found that different personality traits can predict the type of exercise we might enjoy and crucially stick with. Okay, now this is brilliant research, and this is something we do need quite desperately, because of course we do have an obesity crisis, or we have a lot of different crises in the world, which is not good, and that's something that all of us psychologists need to deal with, from mental health implications and everything else. But focusing on the health psychology aspect is that to be able to promote healthy behaviour and to be able to promote exercising, we need to decrease the barriers as much as possible. And if you are particularly neurotic and you get nervous and anxious about how people are going to judge you, how you're going to perceive yourself when you do exercise, and this is something that you can just hear though in like everyday conversations, especially when it comes to women in the gym. because they tend to be quite nervous, from what I understand, about like how men are perceiving them, and women are a lot more comfortable in women-only gyms or women-only gym hours. So that's really good. And that's a really good starting point. But if we're able to identify people's personalities and what exercise they're most likely to enjoy and actually stick out of, then this will only benefit everyone, including people with their weight goals, and hopefully in the long term, this could reduce obesity levels, and this would have other benefits for healthcare services too. So just some good food for thought. So the last one is, elsewhere on the web, we place very similar values on various body parts to those who lived thousands of years ago. According to new research by psychologists in the US, in their latest study, they compared the amount of compensation participants shared they would expect for damage to a particular body part to actual compensation records from Kent in the year 600, Sweden in 1220, and current day America, South Korea, and the UAE. These comparisons found surprisingly similar value judgments across these eras and locations, suggesting that lived understanding of the function of each part play a role in building how much we value different parts of our bodies. So there's not a great amount I can actually say about this article, but I do think, and the place where my mind goes immediately is when you look at the insurance policies for different sports stars. For example, I think it was a famous footballer I saw a few years ago. His legs were insured for £2 million. That's insane. But standing towards more reasonable and just everyday people, to be honest, like, our bodies are really important, and our abilities to do certain things come from different body parts. So I think that it's really good that we have this shared understanding, and we do want to be compensated for damage to our body parts. But this does point though towards a certain universal truth, because as this is consistent between the thousands of years and the locations and cultures that never interacted, I do think that it's quite useful to understand that all of us, we do have this shared understanding of the importance of our bodies. I'm not sure what the applied applications of this research would be, but anyone wants to share your thoughts with me, then please do. So I really hope that you enjoy the psychology news section, so let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So whilst I'm still dealing with a whole bunch of different personal bits and pieces, which I can't really go into on the podcast, nor do I want to, which is one of the reasons why I still don't have my audio booth set up, but that will definitely be sorted out by next week. Like, me and my dad, we spoke about it and we said we are going to do it this week. So hopefully, by the time the next podcast episode comes on, I will be back in my audio booth, which I was actually thinking about this the other day, going off on a minor side tangent. I actually don't mind having my very unique setup, which at the moment is literally my duvet pushed up against the wall, my laptop on it, on a small stand, and my microphone on a whole bunch of DVDs. Like, at the moment, it's Castle seasons 1 to 7 and the Indiana Jones films. Very good choices, to be honest. But there are some benefits about not having an audio booth. For example, I'm no longer dying and sweating of the sheer heat of the UK summer, which is a massive bonus. But stepping away from that, I'm having lots of good time, taking some time for myself, recovering after my masters, and also just applying for so many jobs. Like, I'm applying for way more jobs than I ever thought possible, but that's just because I really need a job at the moment, and I'm having lots of time to do some really fun projects. And there's some different psychology projects that I'm thinking about for the future, which should be a lot of fun. Also, and something else that I want to focus on in this personal update is I got two really surprising comments about my interviews. So, last week I went for a few different interviews, and one was to be a social prescriber. Another interview was to become a trainee clinical associate psychologist. So on Monday, I got a phone call from the clinical psychologist who did my interview for the CAP role, and she said that one, I didn't get the job, which I was sad about, and I did allow myself to grieve and process that emotion because that's healthy and that protected my mental health in the long term. But she also said that I did really well. Like, she could definitely see that I was appointable, I was really caring, compassionate, empathetic, and I would definitely be a great member of the team. And the only reason why I wasn't really appointed was because she needed to be quite nitpicky because the level of competition was so high this year. So that was really good, and I really enjoyed that. And it was quite uplifting and surprising. But the thing that really surprised me was also the social prescriber in it, which I thought went really badly. I thought I did so bad at that in it too. Both the CAP job and the social prescriber job said even though I didn't get the jobs, they were so impressed with my skills, my abilities, my answers. They actually wanted permission to keep my details on a file. So when there's a job in the future, they can contact me and hopefully I can apply and become part of the company that way. So I think there are a few lessons for all of us to learn from this. One, you are always the worst judge of your own actions. You are always the worst job at your own interviews, because I thought that the social prescriber interview went so bad. Turns out I actually did really well, and I was really impressive to them, something I still find quite surprising. But another thing that it goes to show is that even when you think that, oh, I've failed, as in I failed to get a job, there can still be other opportunities, there can still be other benefits. Benefits though, like I might be able to get a job because they keep my details on a file, and I also might be able to get a job because the clinical psychologist who I was talking to actually said I really hope that our paths cross again. And it was just those small interactions which were lovely, and they create opportunities for the future. So just something to think about this week. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And as always, please send pictures of where you're listening from. I always love to see where all of you are all over the world. So today's podcast episode has been sponsored by Developmental Psychology, a guide to child and developmental psychology. Now this is a brilliant sponsor for today's episode because learning difficulties tend to develop in a childhood, and this is when they first tend to manifest. So by understanding developmental psychology, both in terms of typical development, but also atypical development, we can start to understand how these different learning difficulties impact our cognitive processes, our social world, and the child's mental health over time. Therefore, certain topics that connect with today's episode include cognitive development, learning through play, the social environment, social interactions, and brain development. All of these are really critical in our understanding of how children should develop, but then these learning difficulties can help us understand why some children develop atypically. So it's a brilliant book. I love it. It's really fascinating, and this is a really popular book, so I cannot recommend it enough. So that is Developmental Psychology, a guide to developmental and child psychology, available for all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback versions from Amazon, local bookstore or local library if you request it. And if you want the AI generated audiobook, then now you can, at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive, Biblioteca and Bacon Taylor. So whilst buying books help to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. And if you wanted to become a patron of the show for only a few dollars a month that you can cancel at any time and get a whole host of great rewards, including over 70 exclusive blog posts which can be made into podcast episodes for weeks, months or even years, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Con Whiteley. So that's enough personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what is dysgraphia. This is a really fun podcast episode, but before we dive into it, I just want to remind the people again that the content part of today's episode is recorded by my AI voice clone. I really like it. I was actually shocked after last week's podcast episode just how realistic it is. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode just as much as I did. What is dysgraphia? Dysgraphia is a learning difficulty or learning disability that can impair a person's spelling as well as handwriting. The reason why it can be a learning difficulty or a learning disability is because to have a learning disability, you need to have below average intelligence. So this is under 70 IQ points, whereas a learning disability is a condition where someone with average and above average intelligence can have. In addition, dysgraphia isn't a mental health condition. Instead, it is a neurodevelopmental condition that is characterized by a difficulty in forming letters, staying within lines, having good handwriting, expressing your ideas on a paper, and spelling words correctly. Personally, I understand why the woman doing the assessment wanted to test me for dysgraphia. She started talking about dysgraphia once she saw just how horrible my handwriting was, and coupled with dyslexia, it would explain why I struggled with spelling, forming letters and writing. My assessor described dysgraphia as the opposite of dyspraxia. Dyspraxia is a difficulty with gross motor skills, whereas dysgraphia is a difficulty with fine motor skills. The reason why she didn't want to give me a dysgraphia diagnosis is because I have an above average typing speed, so my fine motor skills are fine, even though I highly suspect my friends, family and loved ones would highly disagree at times. Linking this to diagnosis more widely, there isn't a single specific test for dysgraphia. Instead, dysgraphia is tested for using a battery of assessments that includes fine motor skill tests, general writing ability, and spatial processing. A person undergoing a dysgraphia test might be tested on their word and letter formation as well as written expression. Also, a person's past school reports, written assignments, and teacher and parent input might be used as part of the assessment. Another reason why this links to my own learning difficulties assessment is because I mentioned that my typing skills are above average, whereas for people with dysgraphia, because the condition impairs their fine motor skills, this can lead them to experience difficulties with typing, even though sometimes this isn't the case because both typing and writing use different motor skills. So this is why the use of a keyboard is an effective accommodation for children as well as adults with dysgraphia. Moreover, dysgraphia is typically diagnosed in early elementary school, or for my UK listeners, early primary school, because this is when the child is first learning to write, but you can be diagnosed later on in life, including adulthood. And whilst having messy handwriting doesn't automatically mean someone has dysgraphia, because a lot of people have messy handwriting, individuals with dysgraphia tend to find writing neatly to require intense effort and intense concentration. This is another reason why looking at clusters of symptoms is important when it comes to psychological diagnosis. Additionally, the reason why psychologists and other professionals need to be aware of dysgraphia is because it is really frustrating for the children and adults who have the condition. The symptoms and the social consequences of the condition can lead to high levels of emotional distress, especially because when we think about it, someone with dysgraphia will struggle to spell written words as well as write at a normal speed, but they won't have difficulties with speaking or reading. As someone with dyslexia, I know how annoying it is to not be able to spell. You tend to be the butt of jokes, there will be judgmental comments from other people, and people who don't understand you might be horrible to you. I've often had interactions that have left me feeling sad, stupid, and a little pathetic. Another fact about dysgraphia is that the condition can occur in isolation, or you can have other comorbidities, for example, dyslexia, and if we combine dyslexia and dysgraphia for a moment, then not only does a person struggle to write at a normal speed and correctly spell words, but they're also going to have difficulties reading and understanding written words. This only adds to the emotional distress and additional difficulties that the child or adult faces when it comes to oral and or written language. A final note for this section is that children with ADH have a higher than average chance of developing dysgraphia, and it is more likely for girls with ADHD than boys to develop both dyslexia as well as dysgraphia. Just remember that this does not mean that ADHD causes dysgraphia, it is just a comorbidity. What causes dysgraphia? Whilst the exact cause of the condition isn't fully understood, dysgraphia does tend to run in families, so it is understandable that there is a genetic component of the condition. Also, dysgraphia is a complex condition because it impacts the control of motor skills, word organization, thinking about words, working memory, and generating ideas. This is why children with dysgraphia tend to struggle with orthographic coding. This is the ability to store written words in working memory or to form memories of written words, as well as children with dysgraphia can struggle to plan finger movements too. In addition, you can have something called acquired dysgraphia. This is when a person develops dysgraphia following a stroke or brain injury. Finally, for this section, it is important to note that dysgraphia and dyslexia are different conditions because they tend to get mixed up. Dysgraphia is a condition that specifically impairs a person's ability to write and it impacts their spatial processing and motor skills, whereas dyslexia impairs a person's ability to read because dyslexic people have difficulties retaining or explaining information that they've just read. They don't always recognize words by sight and they have trouble with sounds. What are the symptoms of dysgraphia? As with all neurodevelopmental and mental health conditions, that we look at on the podcast, everyone's presentation of symptoms will look slightly different. At the end of the day, we are all different people with our own bodies, backgrounds, and expressions, but there are some common symptoms. The main difficulties for people with dysgraphia can be boiled down to difficulties with language processing, spatial perception, and/or fine motor skills. Firstly, people with dysgraphia tend to use incorrect lack of punctuation or capitalization in their writing. They poorly form individual letters and they omit words from sentences. This is a massive issue that my MSc dissertation supervisor had with me in a joking way because I cannot capitalize words correctly to save my life in titles. In my subheadings, I am semi-famous for capitalizing every single word including of and the, when it turns out they shouldn't be. Another cluster of dysgraphia symptoms include having a painful or awkward pencil grip and or an unusual position of the body, arm or wrist when writing. They experience frequent hand cramps when they're writing and they skip letters when writing words. As I mentioned earlier, this was largely why the assessor didn't agree with a dysgraphia diagnosis for me, because I didn't have fine motor difficulties. I don't put my hands or wrists or body in a weird position. In fact, I try to be very ergonomically conscious. So putting my hands and body in painful positions would go against who I try to be. A final cluster of symptoms of dysgraphia include having poor sentence organization, and the sentences might be grammatically incorrect. They use words incorrectly and have difficulty thinking and writing at the same time. Given all of these symptoms, it isn't surprising to learn that writing can be painful and really frustrating for people with dysgraphia. This leads people with the condition to want to avoid writing altogether, and they feel distressed at the idea of having to write. Unfortunately, this leads children with dysgraphia to be described as lazy, unmotivated, and other horrible names, so this harms the child's self-esteem. It's even worse when these negative self-perceptions might last into adulthood, even more so if the dysgraphia isn't treated and diagnosed. This reminds me of a series of interactions I had with a young student who had socio-emotional difficulties, and she hated reading because she was embarrassed by it. I didn't want to shame her, make her feel worse about reading or anything like that. Instead, I worked with her to build her emotional and social skills so she could feel more confident. I was even happier when I got her to do some reading towards the end of our work together. This is why it's always important to listen, respect, and work with the student instead of thinking of them as lazy or anything else negative. How is dysgraphia treated? Similar to other learning difficulties, there is no cure for dysgraphia, and this means early intervention and specialist coaching in all skills related to the written language is important in dysgraphia treatment. In the terms of schools, they should make accommodations necessary to help the child improve their handwriting and anything else they need to be able to thrive. Other treatment options for people with dysgraphia include physical exercises to strengthen their hand muscles, having extra time to complete written assignments, and reduced writing workload, as well as they can do writing activities that help the child to learn how to write complete letters, develop motor control, increase their handwriting speed, write letters from memory, and spell the most important and common words that they need to use. Furthermore, people with dysgraphia can get wider support through a speech and language therapist, an occupational therapist, a special education teacher, and sometimes a psychologist is needed to help a child deal with their frustration and anxiety. Of course, it's difficult to add any more depth because everyone with dysgraphia will need different levels of support, different needs, and different accommodations. In terms of treatment for adults with dysgraphia, adults can benefit from occupational therapy because if a person can modify their environment through formal or informal accommodations, then this means they might become more successful at work and in their home life. For example, adults with dysgraphia might benefit from speech to text software, taking notes on a laptop instead of by hand, using graph paper so it's easier to write neatly and stay inside the lines, as well as using PDF versions of paper forms. Finally, a reason why aspiring and qualified psychologists need to be aware of dysgraphia is because adults with the condition might benefit from psychological therapy, especially if their self-esteem has been harmed by the condition, even more so if they spent their childhood being called lazy, stupid, or anything else that has eroded their self-esteem over the years at no fault of their own. Therefore, it's important for us, aspiring and qualified psychologists, to work with clients with dysgraphia to recognize that their condition is a neurological condition that has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence and their self-worth. This allows adult clients to, over time, rebuild their confidence and figure out how to cope with the difficulties that they face. Conclusion. At the end of this psychology podcast episode, I'm really glad that we now understand a lot more about dysgraphia. It isn't a condition we often hear about, but that doesn't mean as aspiring or qualified psychologists that it will never impact our clinical work. I always think it is best to try and learn as much as we can, so just in case a client with dysgraphia walks into our therapy room, we can help them as best as we possibly can. And of course, if you're working with a client with dysgraphia, you will need to learn a lot more about the strategies to help them and the condition. Yet I hope that this episode has given you a foundation to build your understanding, practice, and exploration of the condition. And ultimately, I hope you enjoyed today's episode just as much as I did. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. Like I know that I did, because talking about dysgraphia, talking about this developmental condition, which I was almost diagnosed with, or at least I was investigated for this diagnosis, it was really interesting. It was really helped me to understand how different neurodevelopmental conditions and learning difficulties overlap, and why, when it comes to being an aspiring clinical psychologist, it's important to look at someone's life context, someone's cluster of symptoms, instead of just one or two symptoms. Because one symptom, for example, difficulties with spelling, applies for both dyslexia and dysgraphia. But when you would take into account a whole bunch of other factors, then you can understand why there's very distinct conditions and why I only meet the diagnostic criteria for dyslexia. So really interesting, it's a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did. And if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the words about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, then please check out Developmental Psychology, available in all the usual places. And you can get the AI generated audiobook available from selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and many more. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis that you can cancel at any times, then now you can at patreon.com/the Psychology World podcast. And that gives you access to a whole bunch of exclusive blog posts, so I really do recommend it. But if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Conor Wiley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.